who is going to talk to us about easier distributed storage.
Thank you. So at LCA 2018 in Sydney last year, Sage Weil presented Making Distributed Storage Easy, Usability in Ceph Luminous and Beyond. So I'm here today to present somewhat of a sequel to that talk, covering the changes that we've made in the meantime and what's still coming down the track. So the story so far, once upon a time there was Ceph. But if I tell that whole story, I won't have any time left for the rest of this talk. So you should probably watch A Gentle Introduction to Ceph, which I presented 2 years ago in sysadmin, before listening to the rest of what I'm about to say. You'll have to do it very quickly. Go. Okay. If you're not familiar with Ceph, Ceph is awesome. It provides object, block, and file storage in a single horizontally scalable cluster, so you can just keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger, with no single points of failure. It's free and open source software. You can run it on commodity hardware, and it tries to be self-managing wherever possible. So it will notice when disks fail, and it will replicate data somewhere else, so you know that your data is always stored reliably. It does background scrubbing and things like that. And it tries to balance the data evenly across the cluster. But you do still need to actually administer the thing. Which leads to the first point, I think, that Sage made last year. Ceph is hard. Traditionally, the status display and the logs were difficult to parse visually. There were and still are lots of configuration options. Authentication can be tricky to set up. People always have difficulty figuring out the number of placement groups that each pool has. That's sort of an internal detail about how Ceph shards the data across the cluster. But you want to get it right, and it's hard. And of course, the fact that you have to do everything via a command line interface, unless you've got a third-party GUI tool of some kind. Now, I'd like to be able to flip that to the past tense, because a bunch of those things were already fixed in the Luminous release in August 2017. So the status display and the logs were cleaned up. There's a balancer module that you can run to help clean up the edge cases of when data distribution gets a bit funny. Crushed device classes were added back in Luminous, so the cluster will notice if you're using SSDs versus hard disks, and you don't have to fiddle around with custom crush profiles yourself. They're sort of already there. And a new in-tree web dashboard was added. Just read-only, so you get cluster status, and you can't make any changes with it, but there was something that became very clear that there needed to be some sort of GUI out of the box rather than necessarily having third-party tools. But we can't go all the way to saying Ceph was hard, because that might imply that everything is now easy. So until we reach that frabjous day, I'm just going to say that Ceph is easier now and will continue to get easier in future. Last LCA, we were halfway through the Mimic development cycle. The development cycles are 9 months now. And at that time, the major usability enhancements planned for the coming releases included centralizing configuration management, so that you didn't have to worry so much about having a whole lot of stuff in ceph.conf, which you had to replicate across all of the nodes in the cluster. There was a plan to do some slick deployment stuff in Kubernetes using Rook. The dashboard was intended to become vastly improved and actually sort of rebuilt based on and derived from the OpenAttic third-party GUI, which a team from SUSE had developed. And placement group merging. Remember I said that it's tricky to get placement groups right? When you're setting up the number of placement groups for a pool, if you got it wrong on the low side, you can always increase the number of placement groups. If you got it wrong on the high side, you couldn't decrease them, so you were screwed. Delete the pool, make it again. So placement group merging is the thing that lets you reduce that number again. So some of that stuff was completed for Mimic, which was released in June 2018. And more of it's coming in the Nautilus release, which is due very, very soon. In terms of usability improvements, Mimic gave us the new dashboard that I mentioned. This is Angular.js thing, both inspired by and derived from the work on OpenAttic. It had all of the features of the Luminous dashboard, so various status display and whatnot. And on top of that, so the Luminous one, you could just go and see it. There was no authentication or anything. So the dashboard v2 in Mimic brought username and password authentication, SSL support, RBD volume management, RADOS gateway management, and a configuration setting browser. The centralized configuration management part is interesting because config options can now be centrally stored on the mons and managed by the monitors. And what will happen now, I forget the exact order, but Ceph will go and look, when it starts up, it'll go and look in the, there's a few places it looks, but it'll look in the config file, and if there's something that's not there, it'll look in the, what's been set in the mons, and then it'll fall back to a default. And this means that for initial cluster bootstrap, you can get away with possibly having almost nothing in Ceph.conf now, I think, even to the point of using DNS service records to define which host are the mons. So you can do away with having to specify initial mon hosts and things like that. So that, and everything else, rather than having to write it to a configuration file and then copy the file to all of the other hosts. And I know you can do that with automation tools, but and then restart daemons and things. You can just run ceph config set whatever, and it will set that option immediately. Nautilus, as I said, is due out really soon and will include a bunch more good stuff. PG auto-scaling is interesting. Because Nautilus brings PG merging, so we can now increase or decrease the number of placement groups for a storage pool. You can do that by hand. Figuring out placement groups is you've got to know how many pools you've got, how many disks you've got, and you try to aim for about 100 per OSD, and you turn your head sideways and squint a little bit. Ceph will try to take care of this for you if you turn on PG auto-scaling, based on certain storage size targets that you can set. So something that you can actually think about and relate to is how much space I want to use for certain things, rather than trying to go through irritating calculations to figure out the number of PGs. You don't have to have it on automatically. You can have it so it will warn you if things go outside a certain range, and then you can decide to take over by hand and change it at a time that suits you. Because, of course, changing the number of placement groups means there will be a certain amount of data that moves around, and that can have performance implications. And, of course, further dashboard enhancements, including multiple users and roles now, single sign-on via SAML2, internationalization and localization. There's meant to be a bunch of different languages that you can view and use this thing in now. It will do iSCSI target and NFS Ganesha management. So if you've got a Ceph cluster and you have legacy clients or clients that don't speak native Ceph protocols, you might have iSCSI on Windows that you want to talk to a Ceph cluster, or you can expose CephFS via NFS. And those things are not part of Ceph per se, but they're definitely things that you would want to be able to administer from within a Ceph administration dashboard. The dashboard also, if you've configured Grafana and Prometheus, the Ceph dashboard is capable of embedding if you set the right option, it will embed your Grafana dashboard inside there. So in one place you can see all of the Ceph-specific stuff that's going on. And I have a few screenshots to follow just to give some flavor and highlight a couple of other things that's in there now that weren't before. The default status screen looks something like this. It would be slightly more impressive if this were a real cluster and not a toy cluster with 1 mon and 5 disks. But you get the idea. You can easily see at a glance that health is okay, the monitors are in quorum, the OSDs are up, I've got managers, metadata servers, the number of hosts, and etc. And there's a certain amount of information here we can see about performance stuff, IOPS, throughput, read and write, etc. When we go to OSD management, this was not there in the previous version in terms of the things that you can do to OSD. So here we can see disk usage, read and write bytes, and you can, on individual OSDs, you can mark them up or down, or you can trigger scrubs and deep scrubs and things. And you can set individual options in here or global options for the cluster. If you were taking a node down to put it under maintenance, you would want to set no out, perhaps, because if you've taken a node down for too long, Ceph will go, ooh, those disks are gone, I better start rebalancing things. But if you've deliberately taken a node down for maintenance, you don't want to do that. So this is where you would go and set that option to stop that thing from happening. The configuration editor, the configuration settings editor, actually will very helpfully tell you what the configuration settings actually mean and do, which is quite nice, if anybody's tried to work that out. And of course, pool management. You can create, edit, and delete storage pools and see various statistics. You can select erasure code profiles and so on. There's more in there than that, but that's a few of the highlights. Further things coming up in Nautilus. Blinky lights is the ability to turn on or off the ident and fault LEDs on disks backing a given OSD so that you can find the damn things. If you've got a failed OSD and you've got a rack, rows of racks that stretch all the way down to there and you want to pull it out, it'd be really nice to see it flashing. The Blinky light functionality, I mean, internally this is calling lib storage management to blink something, but you've got to be able to call that somehow. So the Blinky light functionality and some of the dashboard functionality, notably the configuring iSCSI gateways and NFS Ganesha, means that Ceph needs to be able to talk to whatever tool it was deployed with. Because Ceph doesn't know much about your hardware or your environment beyond what it's already running on. It doesn't know what disks you have in an unconfigured box that you might want to use next. You couldn't use Ceph to go and blink the lights on a failed disk if the Ceph OSD software on that node happened to have crashed, but your orchestration tool was still running. Ceph couldn't help you there. So Ceph needs to be able to talk to whatever tool it was that deployed the cluster, which leads to the final big thing that I want to talk about for the Nautilus release, which is the orchestrator module or orchestrator modules. So there's a bunch of ways that you can deploy Ceph, and as I said, your deployment tool will always know more about the environment than Ceph does and have more power to do things than Ceph itself will. But if you're managing Ceph through the inbuilt dashboard and command line tools, there's things that you want to do from that perspective as a Ceph administrator, like deploy new OSDs or replace a failed disk, or manipulate those slightly external slightly external services like iSCSI and NFS Ganesha. And Ceph itself can't do that. You can't deploy a new MDS from within Ceph or a new Rados gateway or a new Ganesha host. So for these things, you have to rely on your deployment tool, whatever it happens to be. And so Nautilus, to facilitate this, Nautilus is including an orchestrator module, orchestrator modules for several deployment tools, for Ansible, for DeepC, which is the salt-based deployment tool that we developed at SUSE, and for Rook. And this means that Ceph itself, there's a command line tool you can use inside Ceph to set what orchestrator you want to use and to ask the orchestrator to give you an inventory of disks and to start to do things. And all of that stuff also, too, will be available through the dashboard. So inside Ceph, when you're using the command line tool or when you're looking at the dashboard, Ceph itself doesn't have to care how the back-end orchestrator tool really works, just so long as each of these modules that we implement expose a particular API, get inventory, add service, check service status, add OSD, remove OSD, replace OSD, that sort of thing. So that's exciting. That's a bit I'm working on at the moment. Somebody has also written an SSH orchestrator, so if you're not using any of these fancy things, you can still, I see laughter. No, it's really a thing, people want it. So beyond Nautilus, Octopus is the next release, due out in a bit more than 9 months. And on the usability front, I know that we can expect more dashboard and more orchestrator functionality. Redeploying, replacing OSDs and things, I kind of don't expect that to be in the orchestrator in time for Nautilus. Don't quote me on that. This is recorded. Anyway, but before that, we've got Cephaloconf 2019 is coming up in Barcelona on the 19th and 20th of May, attached to KubeCon and Cloud Native Con. The CFP for that closes on February the 1st. So if you would like to submit something for that, or attend, or both, I'm sure that would be most welcome. And I haven't got a slide for this, but if you are interested in more details than I have had time for here about things that aren't just usability, and you can manage to get to FOSDEM in about a week and a half, Sage will be giving a rather longer talk about what's coming up next in Mimic then. And with that, I'm unbelievably slightly under time. If you're interested in these slides, including my fairly copious speaker notes, you can get them here. There's more laughter from the audience from the fine gentleman that I stole this presentation template from. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found that informative and not too baffling or confusing for those of you who haven't seen Ceph before.
Hi, nice talk, thank you. We've built several Ceph clusters using Ceph Deploy. Are the orchestrator modules going to deprecate self-deploy?
Are the orchestrator modules going to deprecate Ceph Deploy? The short answer is yes. The Ceph Deploy has really, it's not been under active development for some time because we sort of, I mean, all of the pieces that we needed to add to supporting Luminous to support the manager daemon and such, and have all sort of been added along the way, but because it's Ceph Deploy is really cumbersome to use at scale, or you know, and so we really, it's easy. Yeah, this is the problem. That's a longer discussion. We should talk later.
One more question, maybe?